Jacob sat at his usual corner booth in the quiet diner, the hum of the ceiling fan blending with the faint clatter of dishes. To the world, he was just another tired man with weary eyes, seeking solace in the solitude of a meal. But Jacob wasn't just anyone. Beneath the calm exterior lay a storm, a history of battles fought in the shadows, both on foreign soil and within his own mind. The diner was his retreat, a place where no one asked questions. Tonight, however, something felt different. The usual buzz of quiet conversations and the rhythmic scrape of forks on plates seemed oddly muted. It was as if the air carried an unspoken tension, a precursor to something he couldn't yet see. As he sipped his coffee, his gaze wandered. It landed on a little girl at a table across the room. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her hair was tied in a messy ponytail, and her oversized sweater seemed to swallow her tiny frame. She sat beside a man, clean-shaven, sharply dressed, the type who exuded control. But the way his fingers gripped his phone, the way his jaw tightened as he hissed into it, suggested something darker. Jakub's instincts prickled. The girl wasn't eating. Her eyes darted around the room, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if it were her lifeline. She wasn't just nervous. She was terrified. And then, for the briefest moment, her eyes locked with Jacob's. It wasn't the kind of look a child gives a stranger. It wasn't curiosity or innocence. It was desperation, raw and pleading. Before he could process it, she looked away, her small shoulders curling inward, as though to make herself invisible. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. He had seen that look before, in war zones, in hostage situations, in the faces of people who had nowhere else to turn. But this was no battlefield. This was a diner in a sleepy town, yet something about that little girl screamed danger louder than any gunfire he had ever faced. The man ended his phone call abruptly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He leaned toward the girl, muttering something Jacob couldn't hear. Her body stiffened. The man's hand rested on her shoulder, and though it appeared casual, it was anything but. It was a grip, firm, unyielding, and controlling. Jacob's hand instinctively drifted toward the pocket where his phone rested. Should he call someone? The police? But what would he say? That he had a gut feeling about a stranger in a diner? He'd need more than that. Before he could decide, the girl slipped off her chair. Her steps were small and hesitant, each one echoing in Jacob's ears as she approached him. She stopped just a foot away, looking up at him with those same desperate eyes. "Uncle," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jacob leaned in, his heart pounding as he waited for her to continue. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling, "help me. My mom's in danger, and he's not my dad." Time seemed to freeze. Jacob's breath hitched as her words sank in. 1,000 scenarios raced through his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. He glanced back at the man, who was now glaring at them with a mix of suspicion and anger. Jacob knew he had to act fast. He straightened up, his gaze hardening as his instincts from years of combat kicked in. The little girl wasn't just asking for help. She was entrusting him with her life. But what could he do without making the situation worse? The diner wasn't a battlefield, but it felt just as dangerous. Every move had to be calculated, precise. Lives depended on it. What would you do if you were in Jacob's shoes? How far would you go to help someone who needed you the most? The next steps Jacob takes will change his life forever. If you want to see how this incredible story unfolds, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this dramatic rescue story. Your support helps us bring more gripping tales like this one to life. See you in the next video. Jacob's mind raced as he processed the little girl's plea. Her words echoed in his head. "My mom's in danger, and he's not my dad." It was a sentence that carried the weight of terror and desperation, and Jacob couldn't ignore it. His instinct as a protector kicked in, but he knew he had to tread carefully. This wasn't a battlefield where he could rely on sheer force. This was a delicate situation that could spiral out of control in an instant. The man, not her dad, Jacob reminded himself, was now watching him intently. His sharp eyes flicked between Jacob and the little girl, his face twisting into a tight, controlled smile. "Emma," the man called out, his voice sickly sweet but with an undertone of menace. "Come back here. Don't bother the nice man." Emma froze, her small frame trembling. Jacob noticed the way her tiny hands clenched into fists at her sides, as though summoning every ounce of courage she had. But she didn't move. Instead, she glanced back at Jacob, her eyes silently begging him not to let her go. Jacob stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "She's not bothering me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "In fact, I was just about to ask if she's okay." The man's expression darkened for a split second before he plastered on a forced grin. "She's fine," he said, rising to his feet. His towering frame and tailored suit radiated authority, but Jacob saw through the facade. This man wasn't used to being challenged. Kids, always looking for attention. Jacob took a step closer, positioning himself between Emma and the man. "Funny," he said, his tone sharp. "She doesn't look fine to me." For a moment, the diner was silent. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. The other patrons, who had been casually enjoying their meals moments ago, now exchanged nervous glances. Jacob could feel their eyes on him, but he kept his focus locked on the man. The man's smile faltered. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his hostility. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what you think is going on here, but this is my daughter. We're leaving. Now." Jacob didn't move. His body was still, but his eyes were locked on the man with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. "If she's your daughter," Jacob said slowly, "then you won't mind waiting here while we clear things up?" The man's face hardened. "I don't have time for this," he snapped, reaching for Emma's arm. But before he could touch her, Jacob's hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist with a vice-like strength. "I'd rethink that," Jacob said, his voice low and deadly. The man froze, his bravado cracking under Jacob's unyielding gaze. For a moment, Jacob thought he might try to fight back, but the man quickly withdrew his hand and took a step back. He glanced around the diner, clearly aware of the growing attention. The facade of control was slipping, and Jacob could see the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Fine," the man spat, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You want to play hero? Go ahead. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he stormed out of the diner, leaving Jacob and Emma standing in the heavy silence. Jacob's heart was still pounding, but he kept his composure. He knelt down to Emma's level, his voice soft but urgent. "Emma," he said, "you're safe now, but I need you to tell me everything. Who was that man, and what's happening with your mom?" Emma hesitated, her lower lip trembling. He's my mom's ex-husband," she whispered. "He showed up a few days ago and started yelling at her. She told him to leave, but he wouldn't go. He said he'd take me away if she didn't listen to him." Jacob felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Where's your mom now?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "At home," she said, her voice cracking. "He locked her in the basement. She told me to run and find help, but he caught me. He's been dragging me around ever since." Jacob's jaw clenched. He stood, his mind already formulating a plan. He had to act fast. If what Emma said was true, her mother's life could be in immediate danger. "Come on," Jacob said, taking Emma's hand. "We're going to help your mom." Jacob led Emma out of the diner, scanning the parking lot for the man. But Richard was already gone, his car nowhere in sight. Jacob cursed under his breath. He needed to move quickly. They climbed into his truck, and Emma gave him directions to her house. As they drove, Jacob kept an eye on the rearview mirror, half expecting Richard to reappear. The tension in the cab was thick, but Jacob tried to keep Emma calm. "You're brave, you know that?" he said, glancing at her. You did the right thing coming to me." Emma nodded, but her hands were still trembling. "Do you think my mom's okay?" "She will be," Jacob said firmly. "I promise." When they arrived at the house, Jacob parked a few doors down and cut the engine. The house was dark, its silhouette looming against the night sky. There were no lights on, no movement. It was eerily silent. "Stay here," Jacob said, locking the doors. "No matter what happens, don't get out of this truck." Emma's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded. "Okay." Jacob stepped out, his movements silent and deliberate. Years of training had honed his senses, and now every sound, every shadow felt amplified. He approached the house, his eyes scanning for any signs of life. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. That was his first warning. Inside, the house was a mess. Furniture was overturned. Papers were scattered across the floor. It looked like a struggle had taken place. Jacob's pulse quickened as he made his way through the chaos, his ears straining for any sound. And then he heard it. A faint, muffled noise coming from the basement. Jacob moved toward the source, his body tensed for action. He found the basement door and opened it slowly, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. "Mrs. Carter?" he called out softly, his voice steady but cautious. A weak voice responded from below. "Help, please!" Jacob descended the stairs, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. At the bottom, he found Sophia, bound and bruised but alive. Her eyes widened when she saw him. Who are you?" she stammered. "I'm here to help," Jacob said, quickly untying her. "Emma sent me." "Emma," Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Is she safe?" "She's fine," Jacob assured her, "but we need to get out of here now." As he helped Sophia to her feet, a noise from upstairs froze them both in place. Heavy footsteps. Jacob's eyes narrowed. Richard was back. Jacob froze, his hand instinctively tightening around Sophia's arm to steady her. The sound of heavy footsteps upstairs echoed like thunder in the silence of the basement. Richard was back, and this time, Jacob had no doubt that he wasn't alone. "Stay behind me," Jacob whispered, his voice low but commanding. He scanned the dimly lit basement for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a rusted pipe lying against the wall. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Sophia nodded, her face pale but resolute. She clutched her bruised wrist, trying to suppress the tremors running through her body. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, the fear of Richard's return consuming her. Jacob placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, silently communicating that he wouldn't let anything happen to her or Emma. Above them, the footsteps grew louder. Jacob could hear muffled voices, at least 2 men, maybe 3. The faint creak of floorboards sent shivers down his spine. Richard wasn't just coming back for Sophia. He was hunting, and he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. Jacob positioned himself at the foot of the stairs, pipe in hand, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The basement door above them swung open, and light spilled down the stairs, illuminating the dark space. The shadow of a man appeared, followed by a second one, both descending cautiously. Richard's voice broke the silence, smooth and mocking. "Sophia, darling, I know you're down there. You didn't think you could just run away from me, did you? And you brought a friend? How predictable." Jacob's grip tightened on the pipe. The first man reached the bottom of the stairs, a tall, burly figure clearly brought along to intimidate. Jacob acted quickly, stepping out from the shadows and swinging the pipe with precision. It struck the man across the jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. The second man lunged forward, but Jacob was ready. Using his training, he dodged the attack and delivered a swift blow to the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Both men lay groaning on the floor, as Jacob turned his attention back to the stairs. "Impressive," Richard called from above, clapping slowly. "I see you haven't lost your touch, Jacob." Jacob's blood ran cold. The way Richard said his name was too familiar, too knowing. He stepped into the light, revealing his face to Richard for the first time. Richard's smirk widened. "I thought I recognized you," Richard said, descending the stairs with maddening calm. "The old soldier, or should I say, the ghost of my past." Sophia's eyes widened as she looked between the two men. You know him?" she stammered, her voice trembling. Jacob didn't respond. His focus was entirely on Richard, who stopped a few steps from the bottom, his smug demeanor daring Jacob to make the first move. "Don't act so surprised," Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought I wouldn't remember you, Jacob? You were just a pawn back then, another soldier following orders. But I remember you. You were there when everything started to fall apart." Sophia's confusion turned to horror. "What is he talking about?" she demanded. Jacob clenched his jaw. "Not now," he said sharply, never taking his eyes off Richard. Richard chuckled. "Oh, I think now's the perfect time," he said, taking another step down. "Tell her, Jacob. Tell her how you were part of the mission that exposed me, ruined me. You think you're her savior? You're just another reason her life fell apart." "Enough," Jacob growled, his voice like steel. "Let her go, Richard. This is between you and me." "Let her go?" Richard repeated, laughing darkly. "Oh no, Jacob. She's mine. She always has been. And Emma belongs to me too." Sophia stepped forward despite Jacob's warning hand. "You're insane," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "Emma is my daughter. You have no right to her." "No right?" Richard's eyes flashed with anger. "You think you can just take her away from me? From her father?" "You're not her father," Sophia screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "You're a monster." Jacob saw the shift in Richard's stance, a momentary flicker of rage that replaced his calculated calm. He knew the time for words was over. In one swift motion, Jacob stepped forward and swung the pipe at Richard, but Richard dodged, narrowly avoiding the blow. The two men clashed in the cramped basement, a brutal and raw fight that left no room for error. Jacob's military training gave him the upper hand, but Richard's fury made him unpredictable. They traded blows, each one landing with bone-crunching force. Sophia watched in terror, clutching the wall for support, her heart pounding as the man who had tormented her fought the one who had sworn to protect her. As Jacob began to overpower Richard, one of the henchmen he had knocked out earlier stirred. The man reached for a weapon, a knife, and staggered toward Jacob. Sophia saw the movement and screamed, "Behind you!" Jacob turned just in time, grabbing the man's wrist and disarming him with practiced precision. The knife clattered to the floor, and Jacob incapacitated the man with a swift strike to the temple. But the distraction cost him. Richard seized the opportunity, grabbing the pipe and swinging it toward Jacob. It connected with his shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor. Jacob gritted his teeth against the pain, his vision swimming. Richard loomed over him, triumphant. "You should have stayed out of this," Richard sneered, raising the pipe for the final blow. Before he could strike, Sophia acted. She grabbed the discarded knife and lunged at Richard, slashing his arm. Richard howled in pain, dropping the pipe as he turned to face her. Jacob took the chance to tackle Richard to the ground. The two men struggled briefly before Jacob pinned Richard, pressing his forearm against his throat. "It's over," Jacob growled, his voice filled with finality. "You lost." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Jacob released Richard just as the police stormed into the basement, guns drawn. Richard and his men were quickly subdued and handcuffed. Sophia collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face as Emma ran in from outside. The little girl threw herself into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Jacob watched them silently, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. As the officers led Richard away, he locked eyes with Jacob one last time. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You can't protect them forever." Jacob said nothing, his gaze cold and unyielding. The aftermath of the basement battle left a heavy silence hanging in the air. The police had taken Richard and his henchmen away, but the echoes of his threats still lingered in Sophia's mind. She held Emma tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered reassurances to her daughter. Jacob stood nearby, his shoulder throbbing from the blow he had taken earlier, his eyes scanning the scene to ensure no threats remained. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't over. Richard's words, "You can't protect them forever," rang in his ears like a sinister promise. Jacob helped Sophia and Emma into his truck, the only safe place he could think of at the moment. As they drove toward a motel outside town, Sophia broke the silence. "You knew him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Richard? He knew your name?" Jacob's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Yes," he admitted after a long pause. "We crossed paths a long time ago." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean? Who are you, Jacob?" Jacob sighed deeply. Before I left the military, I was part of a covert operation overseas. We were tasked with dismantling a criminal network that trafficked weapons, drugs, and people. Richard was involved. He wasn't the boss, but he was high enough up the ladder to be a target. Sophia's breath hitched. "And you didn't finish the job." Jacob shook his head. The operation was compromised. Someone on the inside tipped him off, and Richard disappeared before we could take him down. I thought he'd vanished for good, until tonight. Sophia stared at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a dark cloud. "So you're saying all of this, what happened to me and Emma, is because of you?" Jacob met her gaze briefly in the rearview mirror. "No, it's because of him, but I won't let him hurt you again." Sophia turned away, her arms tightening around Emma. The little girl, exhausted from the ordeal, had fallen asleep in her mother's lap. For a moment, silence filled the truck, broken only by the hum of the engine. The motel was small and nondescript, tucked away on the outskirts of town. Jacob paid for a room in cash, his military instincts kicking in as he scanned their surroundings for potential threats. Once inside, he secured the door and checked the windows, ensuring they were locked and covered. Jacob knelt in front of her, his eyes steady. "You're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep both of you safe." Sophia looked at him, her expression conflicted. "But why? Why do you care so much? You don't even know us." Jacob hesitated, then spoke softly. "Because I've seen what happens when people like Richard win. And because I owe you." Sophia frowned. "Owe me for what?" Jacob's voice dropped. "I was there. The night everything went wrong in the operation. You were there too." Sophia's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about?" Jacob continued, his voice laced with regret. "You were an asset, someone the team was supposed to extract. I didn't know your name then, but I remember your face. You helped us escape when everything fell apart. You saved my life, and I didn't even realize it was you until now." Sophia's lips parted, but no words came out. She searched his face for any sign of deception, but all she saw was the weight of his truth. I don't remember," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "You wouldn't," Jacob said. "You were in survival mode. But I do, and I swore I'd never let anyone like Richard win again." Just as the tension in the room began to ease, Jacob's phone buzzed on the table. The number was unknown, but his gut told him who it was before he even answered. "Jacob," Richard's voice oozed through the line, sending chills down his spine. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" Jacob's grip tightened on the phone. "You're in police custody. How are you calling me?" Richard chuckled darkly. "Let's just say I have friends in low places. You think taking me out of the picture will solve everything? You don't know the half of it. Check the news, soldier." Jacob hung up and grabbed the remote, switching on the TV. the screen lit up with breaking news. A massive prison transport vehicle had been ambushed. Several high-profile inmates had escaped, and among them was Richard. Sophia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, no, no, no!" Jacob turned off the TV and grabbed his gear. "He's coming for you. We need to move, now." As they packed up to leave, Jacob's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. An image of the motel they were in, taken from the parking lot. Richard's message was clear. "I'm closer than you think." Jacob's mind raced. He knew they couldn't outrun Richard forever. They needed to end this, and they needed to do it on their terms. "We're not running," he said, his voice steely. "We're going to fight." Sophia looked at him in disbelief. "Fight? Jacob, we're outnumbered, and we have Emma. We can't risk her." "She's the reason we have to," Jacob said. "If we don't stop him now, he'll never stop hunting you." Reluctantly, Sophia nodded. Jacob set up a plan, using his military training to fortify the motel room as best as he could. He positioned Sophia and Emma in the bathroom, the safest place, and armed himself with whatever weapons he could find. Night fell and the air grew thick with tension. Jacob waited, his eyes trained on the door. It wasn't long before the first sound came, a faint scuffle of feet outside the window. Then, the door burst open. Richard entered, flanked by two men armed with crowbars. But Jacob was ready. The fight that ensued was brutal and relentless, with Jacob using every ounce of his training to outmaneuver and overpower his attackers. In the chaos, Richard broke away and made for the bathroom. Jacob, bloodied and battered, chased him down. The final confrontation was raw and personal, a battle of wills as much as strength. In the end, Jacob subdued Richard, pinning him to the ground. "It's over," Jacob growled, his voice filled with finality. The police arrived moments later, taking Richard into custody once more. This time, Jacob made sure there were no loose ends, no way for Richard to escape again. Sophia and Emma clung to each other, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Jacob stood nearby, his expression unreadable. As dawn broke, he turned to leave. "Where are you going?" Sophia asked, her voice breaking. Jacob paused, his back to her. "Somewhere I can do more good," he said quietly. "But I'll always be watching." As he disappeared into the morning light, Sophia felt a strange mix of gratitude and longing. Emma looked up at her mother and whispered, "He's our guardian angel, isn't he?" Sophia smiled faintly, pulling Emma close. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." The motel room was in shambles, broken furniture, shattered glass, and bloodstains marking the aftermath of the violent encounter. Jacob sat on the edge of a chair, the adrenaline slowly fading as the pain in his shoulder became impossible to ignore. Sophia and Emma were huddled together on the bed, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and relief. The threat of Richard seemed to have been neutralized, but the tension in the air told Jacob that this wasn't truly over. As police officers swept the scene and escorted Richard and his surviving henchmen into squad cars, one officer approached Jacob. His name tag read Officer Collins. "You did a hell of a job here," Collins said, his tone laced with a mix of respect and curiosity. "But you should get checked out. That shoulder looks bad." Jacob waved him off. "I'll live, just make sure Richard stays behind bars this time." Collins nodded but hesitated, his gaze shifting to Sophia and Emma. "They're lucky to have you. Not many people would put themselves in harm's way like that." Jacob glanced at the two, his expression unreadable. "It's not about luck," he said, his voice low. "It's about doing what's right." As Collins turned to leave, Jacob caught something in his demeanor, a flicker of unease, like he was hiding something. It was subtle, but years of military training had sharpened Jacob's instincts. He filed the observation away, deciding to keep a closer eye on the situation. Hours later, after the police left, Sophia approached Jacob as he sat cleaning a shallow cut on his hand. Her voice was tentative but determined. "Jacob, I need to know. Is this really over?" Jacob's hands stilled and he looked up at her. "For now," he said, his tone cautious. "But men like Richard, they don't just stop. They find ways to manipulate the system to come back stronger." Sophia's face paled, but her jaw set in defiance. "Then what do we do?" Jacob stood, towering over her but speaking gently. "We don't wait, we take control." Sophia blinked, confusion mingling with fear. "What do you mean?" Jacob's eyes narrowed, his voice hardening. "Richard didn't act alone. He's part of something bigger, something dangerous. If we don't dismantle it, he'll always find a way back." Sophia swallowed hard. "You're talking about going after them, the whole network?" Jacob nodded. "It's the only way to end this." Over the next few days, Jacob put his plan into motion. He reached out to an old contact, a former intelligence analyst named Marissa. They had worked together during his time in the military, and if anyone could trace Richard's connections, it was her. Marissa met them in a secure location, her laptop glowing faintly in the dim room. She was sharp, no nonsense, and clearly intrigued by Jacob's new mission. "You're walking into a minefield," she said, after Jacob explained the situation. "Richard isn't just some thug, he's tied to a much larger organization, a syndicate that thrives on corruption and fear." "Can you help us find them?" Jacob asked, his tone unwavering. Marissa smirked. "I can do more than that. I can take you to their doorstep." With Marissa's help, they uncovered a series of shell companies and offshore accounts linked to Richard. The trail led to a remote estate outside the city, a fortress-like compound where the syndicate's leaders were rumored to operate. "It's a long shot," Marissa warned, "but if you can get inside, you might find enough evidence to bury them for good." Jacob's eyes gleamed with determination. "Then we go." Jacob prepared for the mission with military precision, outfitting himself with minimal gear to avoid detection. Sophia insisted on coming along, refusing to stay behind and let Jacob face the danger alone. Though reluctant, Jacob recognized her resolve and agreed, but only after making her promise to follow his lead. Under the cover of darkness, they approached the estate. Emma stayed behind with Marissa, who monitored the situation through surveillance feeds she had hacked into the compound's security system. The compound was a fortress of high walls, armed guards, and surveillance cameras. Jacob and Sophia slipped through the perimeter, using the shadows to their advantage. They moved silently, communicating with hand signals as they navigated the maze-like grounds. Inside, the tension was palpable. The estate was a hive of activity, with men in suits moving purposefully, their conversations laced with ominous undertones. Jacob and Sophia overheard snippets about shipments, bribes, and blackmail, enough to confirm that this was the heart of Richard's operation. Their goal was the central office, a heavily secured room where the syndicate's records were kept. Marissa guided them through the compound via earpiece, her voice steady despite the danger. "You're close," she said. "2 guards outside the door. Can you handle it?" Jacob grinned grimly. "Always." Using his military training, Jacob took down the guards with swift, silent efficiency. They entered the office and began downloading files from the computer. Sophia stood watch, her hands trembling as she held a weapon Jacob had given her earlier. Just as the download completed, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Jacob cursed under his breath. "We're out of time." Sophia's eyes widened. "What do we do?" Jacob grabbed the drive and shoved it into his pocket. "We fight!" The door burst open and armed men flooded the room. Jacob moved like a force of nature, disarming and incapacitating his attackers with brutal precision. Sophia, though terrified, fired a shot that grazed one of the men, buying Jacob precious seconds to regain the upper hand. The battle spilled into the hallway, where Jacob used his environment to his advantage, throwing chairs, flipping tables, and using his bare hands to neutralize threats. Sophia followed close behind, her fear giving way to a fierce determination. Finally, they reached an exit, but not before encountering a familiar face. Richard stood in the doorway, a gun in his hand, and a smirk on his face. "Miss me?" he sneered. Jacob didn't hesitate. He lunged at Richard, the two men colliding in a brutal fight. Punches and kicks landed with sickening force, each man determined to end the other. Sophia watched in horror, her hands gripping the weapon Jacob had given her. As Richard pinned Jacob to the ground and raised his gun, Sophia acted. She fired, the shot echoing through the compound. Richard staggered back, clutching his side. Jacob seized the moment, delivering a final blow that rendered him unconscious. Jacob and Sophia fled the compound as alarms blared. The stolen drive clutched tightly in Jacob's hand. Marissa guided them to a safe extraction point, where they regrouped with Emma. "You did it," Marissa said, her voice tinged with disbelief, "but you've made enemies. Big ones." Jacob nodded grimly. "It's not over, but it's a start." As they drove away, the tension in the air remained thick. Sophia glanced at Jacob, her voice soft but steady. "What happens now?" Jacob looked out the window, his expression unreadable. "We keep fighting, until there's nothing left to fear." Later that night, as Sophia and Emma slept in their temporary safe house, Jacob stood watch. The drive they had stolen contained enough evidence to cripple the syndicate, but he knew the fight was far from over. In the shadows, a figure watched him from afar. Richard's voice echoed in Jacob's mind, "You can't protect them forever." Jacob tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes scanning the darkness. He would prove Richard wrong. But deep down, he knew the war had just begun. The safe house was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. Emma was curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal Jacob had found for her earlier that day. Sophia sat nearby, her fingers tracing the edge of a coffee mug, her mind far away. Jacob stood by the window, staring out into the darkened street, his silhouette blending into the shadows. But he wasn't just watching, he was waiting. Jacob's instincts told him the syndicate wouldn't let them walk away unscathed. They had wounded a beast, but it wasn't dead. It was circling, licking its wounds, waiting for the right moment to strike back. His suspicions were confirmed when Marissa called, her voice urgent. "Jacob, we've got a problem," she said. "I've been monitoring chatter from the syndicate. They're coming for you." "How soon?" Jacob asked, his voice steady. "Tonight," Marissa replied, "and they're not holding back. This is an extermination squad." Jacob exhaled slowly. He had been expecting this, but it didn't make the reality any less grim. He glanced at Sophia, who was now watching him with wide, fearful eyes. "It's happening," he said simply. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We fight," Jacob said, his voice resolute. "And we win." Jacob quickly moved into action, transforming the safe house into a fortress. He barricaded the doors, reinforced the windows, and set traps at every potential entry point. He handed Sophia a weapon and showed her how to use it, his instructions calm but firm. Emma watched silently, her small frame trembling. Jacob knelt in front of her, his voice softening. "Emma, you're the bravest person I've ever met," he said. "I need you to stay in this room no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Will you come back?" Jacob hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "I promise." The first sign of trouble came with a distant rumble, the sound of engines approaching. Jacob positioned himself by the front window, his rifle at the ready. Through the scope, he spotted a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the house. Men in tactical gear poured out, their movements calculated and efficient. "They're here," Jacob said, his voice a low growl. The first wave came fast. The attackers tried to breach the front door, but Jacob's traps triggered, sending a wave of smoke and blinding light through the entryway. He took out 2 men through the smoke, his shots precise and deadly. Sophia held her position in the back room, her hands trembling as she aimed at the window. When an attacker tried to climb through, she fired, the sound of the gunshot ringing in her ears. The man fell back and Sophia's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let them take Emma. As the siege wore on, the attackers adapted. They used explosives to blow open the barricades, forcing Jacob and Sophia to fall back. The house became a war zone, the air thick with smoke and the sounds of gunfire. But Jacob was relentless. He moved like a ghost through the chaos, taking down attackers with ruthless efficiency. Every step he took was calculated, every shot deliberate. This wasn't just survival, this was war. Sophia covered him from the second floor, her aim improving with every shot. Despite the terror coursing through her veins, she found strength in Jacob's unwavering determination. Then, everything changed. Through the haze of smoke, Jacob spotted a familiar figure. Richard stepped into the house, flanked by two heavily armed men. His face was bruised, his suit torn, but his eyes burned with fury. "Jacob!" he called, his voice echoing through the house. "Come out and face me, or I'll burn this place to the ground." Jacob's jaw tightened. He motioned for Sophia to stay hidden and made his way downstairs. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to end this once and for all. Jacob and Richard faced off in the ruined living room, the walls scorched and the floor littered with debris. Richard held a gun, but Jacob didn't flinch. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, soldier," Richard sneered, "but it ends here." "It ends for you," Jacob replied, his voice cold as steel. The fight that followed was brutal. Richard fought like a man possessed, his attacks wild but powerful. Jacob countered with precision, using his training to exploit Richard's weaknesses. The two men traded blows, the sounds of their struggle echoing through the house. In the end, Jacob gained the upper hand. He disarmed Richard and pinned him to the ground, his knife pressed against Richard's throat. "Do it," Richard taunted, his voice hoarse. "Prove you're no better than me." Jacob hesitated, his mind flashing back to the lives he had taken in the past. Killing Richard would end the threat, but it would also drag him back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. "I'm better than you," Jacob said finally, standing and tossing the knife aside. "And you're going to pay for everything you've done." The sound of sirens filled the air as police swarmed the property. Richard and his surviving men were taken into custody, and this time, Jacob made sure the evidence Marissa had gathered was enough to keep them locked away for good. Sophia and Emma stood beside Jacob as the officers led Richard away. He shot them one last venomous glare, but Jacob didn't waver. The war was over. For now. As dawn broke, Jacob prepared to leave. Sophia approached him, her eyes filled with gratitude and sadness. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked. Jacob nodded. "It's safer for you this way. They'll come for me before they come for you." Sophia reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "You saved us, Jacob. I don't even know how to thank you." "You already have," Jacob said softly. He looked at Emma, who was clutching a small drawing she had made of him. "Take care of her. She's special." As Jacob walked away, Sophia watched him disappear into the horizon, her heart heavy. But as she turned to go back inside, a folded piece of paper in her pocket caught her attention. It was a note from Jacob. "I'll always be watching. Stay safe." What would you have done in Jacob's shoes? Do you think he made the right decision by walking away, or should he have stayed to protect Sophia and Emma? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were hooked by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales like this one. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next thrilling chapter. And tell us, what would you like to see next? Let's keep the conversation going.